Welcome back, everyone, to the Homeric Epic Podcast. If it feels like it was not long since you last heard my voice, then it means I must have published this episode shortly after part 1. Or more than likely, you're just catching up with the podcast, which is even better. Today we'll be covering the second half of Iliad Book 9, which means a couple of things. First off, I don't need to recap Book 8 for you, and that this episode will likely be more dense than the first one. One item of housekeeping before we begin. Pronunciation of the Greek names and places in the Iliad is always a tricky point when discussing the poem. Whether to stick to the original Greek pronunciation, which we're not used to, or to go with the familiar Latinized versions of the names. Now, I've tried to keep things simple up until this point, pronouncing everything very Latinized, very literally in the English, but I've hit a snag. The character in this book, who I've been calling just Phoenix, well, his name is spelled in many translations as Phoenix. And I've just been calling him Phoenix because that's familiar and much cooler sounding, and not hard to pronounce like Phoenix. So if you are reading along and your translation spells it Phoenix, well, he's only here for one book, so please forgive me. Anyways, for those just joining us now, Book 9 opened with Agamemnon in crisis and the Trojans camped outside the Greek wall. A council was called where Agamemnon expressed his fears and said they should all flee. Nestor turned the situation around, luckily, and suggested a more prudent course of action, appeasing Achilles. So they put together an embassy that sets out to Achilles' tent, the grammar of which is a bit strange, but we don't mind if we're reading in English. The embassy then arrives, and Odysseus delivers the list of gifts to Achilles and tactfully asks him to return to the battle. And Achilles just lets him have it. In a fiery, passionate outburst, he says no in the most emphatic way possible. He is insulted and declares he will set sail for home the very next day. Now, it's not the bloody, action-packed Iliad that we are used to, not by a long shot. But I hope I've shown the subtleties hidden within Odysseus and Achilles' speeches here. The remainder of the book is just as straightforward. After Achilles finishes his speech, old Phoenix delivers a long speech containing 3 paradigmatic stories that are highly relevant to the Iliad, to which Achilles replies, and then Ajax says something, and then Achilles replies again, and then the embassy returns to report the news and the book comes to a close. I'm recapping the events rather quickly here because, as I mentioned before, the second half of this book is even denser than the first one. Before we begin the analysis, though, I'd like to personally thank all 50 plus of you for joining me on this journey. When I started this podcast, I was fully ready to just shout it into the void, but it really does mean a lot to me that people listen and learn from this, so thank you. Let's get to it then. We last left the embassy in Achilles' tent after he had finished his forceful speech. Achilles' final words are to tell them to deliver his message with all of its hurtful words, but especially his decision that he will return home the next morning. You may be wondering who this Phoenix guy is, and that would be understandable. I'll let him tell his own backstory, which happens to be very relevant to our present story. Phoenix begins in his reply to Achilles by stating that Achilles' father Peleus dispatched him to Troy to watch over Achilles, and specifically to teach him 2 things, war and speaking in assembly. Phoenix says, quote, "For that reason he sent me to teach you all these things, to be both a speaker of words and a performer of deeds." End quote. Now you may think this is a little strange. Surely for Achilles to succeed at Troy, all he needs to know is how to fight, correct? From what we have seen thus far, certainly not. Time and time again, the Iliad shows us the heroes in council, debating and giving and performing speeches. These scenes of assembly affect the plot far more than the fighting actually does. Phoenix is asserting here that the hero needs both of these traits to succeed, and that both are equal. This is echoed by the poet in Book 1, lines 490 to 91, which read, quote, "Never did he go to the assembly where men win glory, never to war." End quote. The assembly is described here as the place where men win glory, not war. This highlights the importance that the hero be successful in the assembly, because glory can be won there. We can see this trait shine through to different degrees in Diomedes and Ajax. Diomedes, as I have mentioned before, has spoken a couple of times in the assembly already, with varying degrees of success. He is young and still learning to be a speaker of words. Ajax, on the other hand, seems to be lacking in this regard. He is certainly a doer of deeds, but only in this book does he appear as a speaker of words. And we shall see that while it is not as eloquent as the other members of the embassy, it is arguably the most effective speech. Now, besides these literary aspects, I do find this concept of being a doer of deeds and a speaker of words to be quite motivating. I think modern storytelling loves to reinforce this false dichotomy of the eloquent weakling and the dumb jock, but actually this was not the case historically for the ancient Greeks. Their heroes were always both. Even Socrates was known for his physical fitness and stamina, and this is actually a large part of why he was so respected by his peers. Moving forward, Phoenix then neatly segues into the story of how he came to know Achilles. And it is a strange one. The gist of it is that Phoenix's father, Amyntor, had a mistress that he loved more than Phoenix's mother. So the mother begged Phoenix to sleep with Amyntor's mistress so that she would hate the older man. And like any good son, he did what his mother told him to do and obliged her with this extremely strange request. Amyntor found out and cursed Phoenix that he may never have a child of his own, calling upon Zeus of the underworld and dread Persephone to bring the Furies down on him. Quick mythological aside, if your translation uses Zeus of the underworld, and you're wondering who that is, it's simply another name for Hades. Dread Persephone is of course the Persephone from the famous myth, The Rape of Persephone, and Demeter, and of pomegranates and whatnot. And the Furies refer to the spirits of the underworld that punish those who treat their parents poorly. They generally play a crucial role in Greek mythology as the ones who punish oath-breakers, murderers, and general unfilial behavior. Anyways, Phoenix is not pleased that his father has cursed him thusly, and he wants to kill him for this, demonstrating how serious such a curse must have been taken, but he decides not to do so. The text here is a little strange as it says that Phoenix's kinsmen prevent him from leaving, but it's unclear why. They happen to keep him in the palace for 9 days, and then on the 10th day he escapes. This is echoing the 9 time units until something happens on the 10th motif that we found several times throughout the Iliad thus far. Phoenix fled from his father's land and found refuge with Peleus in Phthia. Peleus accepted him and made him ruler of a town on Phthia's borders. Phoenix demonstrates his consummate skill as an orator here as he segues into his relationship with Achilles. Quote, "And you I made as great as you are, godlike Achilles, loving you from my heart, for with no other man were you willing to go out to the feast, nor would you eat in your own halls before I settled you on my knees, and cutting the meat first, gave you your fill and held the wine to your lips. Many times you soaked through the tunic on my breast, spewing forth wine in your troublesome childish way. So I suffered much for you and labored much, with this in mind, that the gods would not create any offspring for me of my own. But you, godlike Achilles, I tried to make my son, so that you might one day defend me from abject ruin." End quote. I say Phoenix is an excellent speaker, because look at what he's doing here. Odysseus has already tried to appeal to Achilles as a father figure by mentioning Peleus in his story. But Phoenix truly is a father figure to Achilles. His backstory mentions how he could never have kids of his own, having been cursed by his father, and that Peleus raised him up to his current position and entrusted his own son to him. Phoenix reminisces with the adorable, touching image of a young bratty Achilles bouncing on his lap, eating pieces of meat at the feast and spitting up wine across his clothes. The love that Phoenix feels for Achilles is so deep, and having established his place as a surrogate father and tugging on his heartstrings a little bit, he launches into the emotional appeal he wants to make, that Achilles might now defend him from ruin. The last thing I'll say on Phoenix's story here is that the concept of the exile fleeing a land and being given refuge closely parallels Patroclus' own story as well. Patroclus, we will learn, was forced into exile and came to live with Peleus when he was a young boy. We'll hear more about this in Book 23. With Phoenix's position as a surrogate father to Achilles firmly planted in both Achilles and our minds, Phoenix launches into the second of his 3 paradeigmatic stories. The tone of this speech is hortatory, and Phoenix attempts to encourage Achilles to follow the example by, as always, giving a mythological justification to a course of action that is presently desired. We've seen this several times already in the Iliad, like Book 1 with Nestor's story of the Lapiths, and in Book 5 with the backstory of Diomedes' father Tydeus. Homeric heroes are always ready with some mythological precedent to justify a current course of action. The story laid out by Phoenix here is that of the Litae and Ate. Ate we have heard of before. It roughly translates to delusion and the ruin caused by blind folly. Litae is commonly translated as prayers, but this doesn't cover the whole meaning. Think of Litae more as requests for forgiveness. Phoenix's second story begins by stating that even the gods themselves can be turned by burnt sacrifices and prayers of propitiation. He then states, quote, "For prayers of penitence exist, daughters of great Zeus, halting and grimacing with squinting eyes. Their concern is to follow blind delusion. Delusion, she is strong and swift of foot, and thus far outstrips all prayers, and over every land she gets ahead to trip up men. But prayers of penitence make amends thereafter. The man who respects these daughters of Zeus when they approach, him they greatly help and heed him as he prays. But the man who spurns and rigidly rejects them, then they go and pray to Zeus the son of Cronus, that delusion will follow him, so that thwarted by his blindness he is punished." End quote. A very weird story. Essentially, delusion is much faster than the prayers of penitence, and rapidly descends upon men, causing them to act foolishly. After delusion, the prayers of forgiveness limp in to make amends, and the one afflicted can choose to respect these daughters of Zeus or deny them. The prayers are described so strangely here. Some translations have them limping along with grimacing and squinting. The reason for this strange description is the difficulty in asking for forgiveness. The slow, reluctant response is symbolically transferred onto the prayers, who actually have physical trouble getting to their destination. Now, I said this was a paradeigmatic story, meaning that it's a mythological pattern story used to encourage a certain behavior. And I did mean that, because this story is Phoenix's subtle way of analogizing through divine myth the predicament thus far between Agamemnon and Achilles. Let me spell it out. Delusion descended upon Agamemnon, which he told us himself just earlier in this very book. And then afterwards, the prayers of penitence, i.e., this embassy, were sent to Achilles to seek forgiveness. Within the story, Phoenix also details what happens to those who ignore the prayers of forgiveness. And it is that he who does not forgive is struck by delusion himself. Now I'm going to quote directly from Malcolm M. Wilcock in his Companion to the Iliad book. Here describing Book 9, lines 508 to 512, quote, "In other words, if A wrongs B, but later apologizes, then it is up to B to accept the apology. If B refuses, then this is arrogant of him, and he may find that he makes some disastrous mistake himself. This is, of course, exactly what happens to Achilles. His refusal of Agamemnon's offer of compensation in this book leads directly to his irrational decision in Book 16 to send his closest friend Patroclus out on his own, and so to his death." End quote. In the most subtle and artful of ways, Phoenix is describing to Achilles his choice and its consequences. He may forgive Agamemnon and listen to the prayers symbolized by the embassy, gain the glory of the gifts, and in returning save the army. Or he may refuse the gifts, and in doing so be struck with delusion and suffer the consequences. Unfortunately for Achilles, though, he cannot see the consequences of such a decision. Such is the blindness of those afflicted by Ate. How could he know that very shortly he would give the order himself to his friend that would bring about his death? Reasons like this are why I think the Iliad is so much better the second time around. The dramatic irony here is so heavy as to be nearly heartbreaking. Achilles cannot yet understand the personal cost of his rage, but he will soon. Phoenix caps off his second tale by stating that he would not blame Achilles for refusing Agamemnon. had he not offered so many gifts. But he has. And even more so, he has sent Achilles his most dear friends to beseech him. Phoenix continues, quote, "Do not slight their word, nor their journey. Before, your anger was not blameworthy." End quote. What Phoenix is suggesting here is that up until this point, they agreed with Achilles. His anger was justified. Agamemnon was in the wrong in their eyes, and they sided with Achilles. But now, well, it's a little murkier. With the extraordinary offer of Agamemnon, Achilles' refusal comes across as arrogant. This brings Phoenix's second story to a close, and right away he launches into his third one, which is also the most detailed and most relevant. The story is about the hero Meleager. He's not the most well-known hero, not a Heracles or a Theseus, but he does make the rounds in Greek mythology more than once. Now, in this instance, I think it's important that we know the other myths surrounding Meleager, so that we might compare and contrast what we're told in the Iliad, because there are indeed some key differences. Meleager's traditional stories begin with the Caledonian boar hunt, of which many heroes of the previous generation were a part of, including Peleus and Telamon, who are Achilles and Ajax's fathers. When Meleager was born, the Fates told his mother that he would die when the log currently in the fire burnt up. So his mother, Althea, promptly removed it from the fire and extinguished it, effectively protecting her son from death. A number of years later, the story goes, the king Oeneus of Caledon was sacrificing to the gods the first fruits from the harvest, but he fatally omitted goddess Artemis from his sacrifice. The goddess was enraged, and so sent an enormous boar to ravage the surrounding regions, preventing anything from being done. King Oeneus then rounded up the greatest heroes of the age, which included the likes of Castor and Polydeuces, Atalante, Peleus, Telamon, Jason of Golden Fleece fame, and Iphicles, Heracles' half-brother. This star-studded cast sets out to kill the boar, and whoever does so will be awarded the glorious pelt, a great honor. Now, despite already being married to a woman named Cleopatra, and no, not that Cleopatra, it's a very common name, before the hunt, Meleager had been eyeing up the beautiful Atalante, and it was Atalante who was the first to hit the boar with an arrow. Meleager finished the boar off and was supposed to receive the hide, but instead dedicated it to Atalante. Now, this upset a couple of other boar hunting participants who were very mad that a woman received the hide over them. And this is where the story diverges in the sources. Some of the more traditional versions has a quarrel break out over the awarding of the hide, and Meleager ends up killing his mother's two brothers. His mother is so distraught over the death of her brothers that she burned the magical log that the Fates told her was tied to her son's life, and so he instantly died. The end. Yes, this version is a bit strange, because in all the other sources of the voyage of Jason and the Argonauts, which happens after the Caledonian boar hunt, Meleager is attested. But such is the nature of Greek myth. Now, the version of Meleager's story told in the Iliad is very different than the one I just relayed, and Phoenix makes it clear at the outset the purpose of this analogous speech he's telling. Quote, "Thus also in days of old we have heard the famous deeds of warrior men. When swelling anger seized them, they were open to gifts and were moved by words." End quote. This is explicitly stated the purpose of this story. The version of the story of Meleager that Phoenix starts here begins in the midst of the conflict over the hide and head of the mighty boar. The Aetolians were defending Caledon and the Curetes besieging it. Then the story works backwards and tells how Oeneus forgot Artemis in the sacrifice of the first fruits, she sent the boar, and that Meleager killed it. Interestingly, it skips over much of the details of the actual boar hunt and Atalante and the uncles, instead skipping to the aftermath of the hunt, that is, the battle between the Aetolians and the Curetes over the head and hide of the boar. Then there's this curious paragraph, quote, "Then so long as Meleager, beloved of Ares, went to battle, so long things went badly for the Curetes, nor could they stand their ground outside the wall, for all their numbers. But when anger entered Meleager, anger that also swells in the breasts of other men, even those of good understanding and shrewd mind, why then, angered in his heart at his own mother Althea, he lay apart with his wedded wife." End quote. Starting to become more clear the connections between this story and Achilles, isn't it? Phoenix has chosen his story well. Meleager, it appears, has been in nearly the exact same situation as Achilles right now. Anger swells his heart and he refuses to fight despite the great need for him. But while the text translates Meleager's emotion here as anger, the Greek word for it is kolos, not menis. Kolos is a more general anger or bitter anger and does not have the same connotations in the Greek that menis has. So Phoenix is also misunderstanding Achilles here a bit by underestimating the depths of his rage. This story then takes a bit of a detour as it launches into the backstory of Meleager's wife's name. The name for Meleager's wife is highly relevant, actually, and not for the reason you may initially think. Cleopatra is certainly a famous name in modern times, recalling the Egyptian queen during the time of Octavian and Mark Antony, but her full name actually was Cleopatra VII Thea Philopater. The reason that these two share the same name is because the famous Egyptian queen Cleopatra is actually Greek, and descended from Alexander the Great's general Ptolemy, who took control of Egypt after Alexander's death. Cleopatra the queen is part of this line of Greek nobles who ruled Egypt until the ascendancy of Rome. Anyways, Cleopatra is simply a very common Greek name, formed from the roots kleos, meaning honor, and pater, meaning father. The name means something like glory of the father. Interestingly, Alexander the Great's stepmom and also his own full sister were both named Cleopatra, so it isn't too surprising to hear such a name in Greek mythology. But what is surprising is who else shares this name, albeit in a different order. The name Patroclus also shares the same roots as Cleopatra, just in reverse order. It's much easier to see in Greek, where his name takes the kappa lambda epsilon ending and really looks like a combination of pater and kleos. Now, the reason for this sharing of name roots between Cleopatra in Phoenix's story and Patroclus' name will become more clear in a moment. We just need to get a bit further into the tale first, so let me continue. After this short genealogy, we learn why Meleager has withdrawn from the fighting. He rages at his mother's curses over the slaying of her brother. Now we found the thread of this story again as it relates to the other version. It seems Meleager did kill his uncle, singular in this version, and his mother has invoked the Furies against him for it. Invoking the Furies against someone was seen as a grave affront to them, as we learned from Phoenix's personal backstory just a few pages ago. But note that there's no mention of a magic log that is tied to Meleager's life in this version of the tale. As a general rule, Homer shies away from some of the more fantastical or folk elements of stories that are contained in the Iliad. This is one such example where the poet has included a specific version of a story to fit the narrative at hand, much like in Book 5 when the poet told us that Aphrodite did not come from the sea like in other versions of the popular myth, but was born of Dione and Zeus. It's a choice to use a specific version of the myth to fit the current story. After learning about the curses laid against him by his mother, we are told that he is not fighting because of this, despite the great need for him. The next part of the story describes the different appeals that those close to Meleager make to him to return to the fighting. They beseech him in order of ascending affection, starting with the Aetolian elders who promised him a great reward. Next, his father Oeneus begs him to return, followed by his sisters and mother. Then his companions, who are described as the most devoted and dearest to him of all men, attempted to convince him. But it's not until his wife, Cleopatra, goes to him weeping and details to him all the evils that will occur to the people when the city is taken, does he relinquish his anger and drive away the Curetes from the city, saving the day. But Meleager was too late to receive the gifts offered to him by the elders in the first appeal. Phoenix then comes to the conclusion of his story, quote, "So he beat back the Aetolians their day of evil, yielding to his own heart. But they never paid him the gifts, the many splendid and welcome gifts, and he averted the evil to no end. But you, Achilles, do not think such things in your mind, nor let some dark spirit turn you that way, dear one. It will be less worthy to defend the ships once they are burning. But come while there are gifts. The Achaeans will honor you like a god. But if without gifts you enter the man-destroying battle, you will no longer be so honored, for all you beat back the war." End quote. This is the point Phoenix so long-windedly wanted to make, that if Achilles will eventually relinquish his anger, he should do so when there are gifts on the table. The paradeigmatic example of a past great hero is supposed to provide clear instructions for how the present hero ought to act, and this is what Phoenix intended with his story. But the story contains more than just this surface intention. There are actually many parallels between it and Achilles' present and his future. Remember the embassies that were sent to beseech Meleager? The ordering was, first, the elders who offered gifts, then the father, followed by sisters and mother, then companions, and finally the hero's own wife. This order is significant because it corresponds to the order that Achilles has been beseeched in this very book. First, the elders make an appeal to him. This is Agamemnon and Nestor and the list of gifts. Next was Odysseus, who in his speech invoked the hero's father Peleus. After that was Phoenix, who again invoked Peleus, but also detailed the tender care that he gave to Achilles, much like a mother would. Last to speak will be mighty Ajax, who twice refers to the embassy as close friends of Achilles. Thus, the embassy of Book 9 is reflected in the paradeigmatic story of Meleager, providing further justification to us that Achilles really should accept the gifts and return to the fighting. It seems quite obvious at this point, both to the heroes and to the audience. But I have omitted something here, haven't I? The identity of the final suppliant, the one that eventually did sway Meleager's heart. Who does this character represent in Achilles' ascending order of affections? That would be none other than gentle Patroclus. Remember when I was describing the etymology of Cleopatra's name and mentioned that Patroclus' name has the same roots? This is why. Their identical names seal the symbolic relation between the two. Achilles' closest companion, the one he loves most in the world, will be the one to finally turn his anger and relent. We will encounter this heart-wrenching episode in Book 16. But I find it fascinating how the story that Phoenix described about Meleager is both descriptive and prescriptive of Achilles' situation. It subtly mirrors the situation of the embassy thus far, yet leaves it open-ended for the time being. It only resolves itself 7 books later when Patroclus, atop the list of Achilles' closest, completes the beseechment of the hero. But at this point, the similarities between Meleager and Achilles end. The exact differences I will leave for a later episode, probably the one covering Book 16. Whew! After such a long series of stories from Phoenix, he finally wraps up, and we get to hear from Achilles again. His tone here is irritated, but he is respectful of his dear old companion. What Achilles is saying, and what the other members of the embassy cannot grasp, is summed up in the first line of this response. Quote, "Phoenix, old father, cherished by Zeus, in no way do I have need of such honor. I think I am honored by the just measure of Zeus, which would keep me by the curved ships as long as life's breath remains in my breast and my knees have motion. And I will tell you something else and put it away in your mind. Do not confound my heart with your weeping and groaning, carrying favor for the warrior son of Atreus. You should not hold him so dear, lest you become hateful to me who love you. It is fitting for you to join me to trouble him who troubles me. Rule equally with me and share half my honor." End quote. In no way do I have need of such honor. That's what the embassy cannot grasp about Achilles. To all of them who swim in the Homeric warrior culture and breathe it as their air, they cannot fathom that someone could do without it, that someone could operate outside of it. Achilles also prods at Phoenix's loyalty, sort of asking where this love for Agamemnon comes from. Surely their relationship supersedes the authority of Agamemnon. Achilles reminds him of this, saying, "You should not hold him so dear, lest you become hateful to me who love you." He reiterates one of the common tenets of friendship, trouble the one who troubles me. Caroline Alexander's translation renders the word as trouble, but the Greek is a bit stronger than that, closer to hatred. But the sum of Achilles' words in reply to Phoenix here are as harsh as he is willing to be towards his old beloved mentor. What they lack in harshness, though, they retain in firmness, as Achilles has made up his mind. He goes on to say that Phoenix should stay the night at his tent and, quote, "When the dawn shows forth, we will consider whether we will return with our men or stay." End quote. Did you catch that? The titanic, immovable rage of Achilles has just budged an inch. In response to Agamemnon's offer, as recounted by Odysseus, Achilles declared that they would leave tomorrow morning. But now, after Phoenix's stories, he has just said that in the morning they will decide whether to stay or not. Clearly, something has changed in Achilles as he went from outright leaving to merely deciding whether to leave. I'll talk about this shift in his attitude at the end of this episode because there are a few more details that we need to consider first. There's a neat line here that parallels one earlier in this book. The poet says, quote, "He spoke, and he motioned silently with his brows to Patroclus to smooth the snug bed for Phoenix, so that with all speed the others would think of going back from his shelter." End quote. Much like the subtle nod of Ajax to signal Odysseus and Phoenix earlier in this book, Achilles signals Patroclus to oust their guests who have certainly overstayed their welcome. It also highlights how close Achilles and Patroclus are. They're on that next level of intimacy where Patroclus can read Achilles' mind just from a nod. Subtle scenes like this are so important for emphasizing their relationship, as the poet doesn't have many chances to throughout the story. Anyways, it's time for the last speech of this embassy. Mighty Ajax completes the trio of speeches, but he does so in an oblique way. I'll quote in full here. "Zeus-descended son of Laertes, Odysseus of many stratagems, let us go, for it does not seem to me that fulfillment of our mandate will be accomplished on this journey. We must report his word without delay, unfavorable even as it is to the Danaans, who surely await us now. But Achilles has made savage the great-hearted spirit in his breast. He is hard, and turns his back on that friendship of companions, for which we honored him beyond all others by the ships. Pitiless, a man will accept payment even from his brother's killer, or for his dead child, and the man who is paid much in penalty remains there, in his country, and the heart and proud spirit of the other is checked, by accepting recompense. But in your breast, the gods have placed an implacable, a baneful spirit, for the sake of a single girl, and now we offer you 7, exceptional, the best, and many other things besides. Gentle your heart, respect your house. We are under your roof from all the multitude of Danaans, and beyond all others, as many as the Achaeans are, yearn to be closest and dearest to you." End quote. Ajax's speech is very different from the others. At the outset, he doesn't even address Achilles, instead speaking to Odysseus and having Achilles hear his words obliquely. Ajax speaks harshly to Achilles, saying he's forgotten the respect and honor that his friends in the army used to pay to him. He adds that the normal thing to do is to accept compensation from the one who has wronged you, like in the case of the death of a brother or son. This acceptance of payment enables the community to remain whole and prevents an endless cycle of blood killing. Mention of this connotes the stories of Phoenix and Patroclus, who both fled their countries because of a murder and were reintegrated by Achilles' father. Part of the way through his speech, Ajax turns to Achilles and addresses him directly. Ajax lays out that, in light of normal custom, Achilles' refusal to accept these gifts in exchange for one woman is absurd. Ajax ends his appeal by mentioning that they have been sent not just as envoys of Agamemnon, but of the whole army, and that they are Achilles' best of friends. But crucially, they are also his honored guests, and come to him in supplication. Thus Achilles, in refusing the gifts, is also committing the tragic blunder of rejecting the suppliant, similar to Agamemnon rejecting Chryses in Book 1. Ajax's speech is summed up as, "Achilles, you are being logically unreasonable based on the accepted practices of our culture. Your best friends are here because we love you, and you are rejecting us because of your proud heart." It's characteristic of the towering, straight-talking bastion of the Achaeans to lay it all out like this. But this speech by Ajax takes on a whole new dimension in light of Ajax's future at Troy. Ajax's future is told in Quintus of Smyrna's Post-Homerica, which tells of events directly following the Iliad. And we also get some very interesting details from Sophocles' play Ajax. Through these sources, we can piece together an episode from later in the Trojan War called The Judgment of the Arms of Achilles. You see, after Achilles dies, the question of who to award his armor to is raised, and Ajax, Achilles' cousin and close companion, believes he should receive it, as with Achilles gone, he is now far and away the best warrior. Ajax was also the one to carry Achilles' body to safety through the vicious fighting as well. But wily Odysseus also desires the armor, and the two of them appeal to the sons of Atreus to resolve who should receive them. In certain sources, the sons of Atreus make the Trojan prisoners of war decide who deserves the armor based on who has caused the most hurt to the Trojans. Based on his cunning and eloquent speech, Odysseus is judged as more dangerous to the Trojans and is awarded the armor of Achilles. At this slight to his honor, Ajax is distraught and resolves to kill all the Greek captains. But Athena beguiles him and causes him instead to slay a herd of sheep. Upon discovering his temporary madness and his shameful acts, Ajax commits suicide using the very sword that Hector gave to him after their duel in Book 8. It's a bleak, tragic outcome for one of the Greeks' greatest heroes. But it's worth noting the similarities between Ajax and Achilles. Both feel they deserve a certain level of honor, and both have it taken away from them. They then try to slay the person who did it, which includes Agamemnon both times, and then Athena comes down to prevent it. But while Athena comes down to stay Achilles' hand and give him advice, she does not do the same for Ajax, instead causing him to go mad and kill the sheep instead. The parallels between the two show the divine favor that Achilles wields, but Ajax does not. It also shows how, in the present situation of Book 9, Ajax can't put himself into Achilles' shoes. He can't imagine feeling so dishonored that any amount of gifts will not be enough to solve it. It simply doesn't occur to him that that's possible. It's only after that he has been dishonored on a similar level as Achilles that he potentially could understand him. But by then it is too late, and he begins to act like Achilles, although without the divine favor. Ajax's final speech to Achilles here then has a tragic light to it. He doesn't realize that very shortly he'll be in a similar situation, and that he too will be made to feel as dishonored as his friend, even as he is now telling him to get over it. Now, as blunt and direct as Ajax's speech to Achilles is, it appears to have actually had the greatest effect on him of the three. Achilles replies and says that all that Ajax has said he agrees with, but he cannot get past what Agamemnon did to him, how he degraded him in front of the army. Achilles then says, quote, "But all of you go and speak my message openly, that I shall have no thought again of blood-stained war until the son of brilliant Priam, shining Hector, reaches the ships and shelters of the Myrmidons." End quote. Just moments before, Achilles had declared that he will decide whether or not to leave tomorrow morning. But now, after Ajax's speech, he has adjusted his stance quite significantly. Note that this is actually the exact thing he wished from his mother Thetis in Book 1, that the Greeks be penned against their ships so that Agamemnon might feel his absence even more. So in a way, he hasn't modified his stance much overall. But then for what was the initial threat to return home the next day? Well, one reason for this change of stance from the first speech to the last could be due to mirroring the threats he made in Book 1. Initially, when he was first outraged around line 167 of Book 1, Achilles threatened to return home immediately. Then, when Athena stops his slaying of Agamemnon, he adjusts his choice to the milder, "Someday a yearning for Achilles will come upon you," until finally he does relent and give up Briseis, but he warns Agamemnon from taking any other property. This actually shows that Achilles' wrath is a bit malleable. He may be willing to budge slightly, but not completely. The other reason for Achilles' initial harsh reaction to the gifts becomes more clear if we consider it from his own position. Since Book 1, Achilles has been alone. He has not participated in any of the events of the story, nor have any of the characters been in contact with him. When his dearest friends show up at his door, they are not there out of sympathy for him, but as spokespersons for Agamemnon. None of them report that they feel sorry for him, and more importantly, none of them report that Agamemnon feels any remorse. They show up at his tent with a list of shiny objects, things which to Achilles have been proven to have zero value, prizes of honor that can be taken away so easily have no value for him anymore. And the only thing he wants is for Agamemnon to be humiliated, and through this his true honor will show forth, but this has not happened yet. Because this is his true goal, he can't actually leave Troy, but the initial offer of the gifts is so insulting to him and delivered by messengers he thought would support him, that his immediate reaction is the fiery rage that has been smoldering inside him. After Ajax's speech, Achilles himself admits that Ajax is right, but he cannot move past it regardless, and especially not by being given gifts. So the embassy dissolves and returns to Agamemnon's tent. Agamemnon asks for Odysseus' report, and Odysseus gives it to him, sparing him most of the harsh language. Note that Odysseus delivers the reply given to himself that Achilles will leave the next morning, because this was the response from the official offer from Agamemnon. But also because it doesn't matter, Achilles is not going to help regardless. Not the response that Agamemnon was hoping for. During their stunned silence, Diomedes jumps in, saying Agamemnon should not have offered the gifts, because Achilles is known to be a proud man. He also says Achilles will join when he's ready, and as a show of strength, Agamemnon, you should join the fighting to rouse the men. They then pour some libations, and the book ends. Iliad Book 9, I think I have shown, is dense. To me, personally, it has always been the living, beating heart of the poem. Except instead of pumping blood, it just pumps Achilles' rage from Book 1 to Book 24. There's so much intricacy that I haven't touched on, but I'll close this out by highlighting a couple more topics regarding Book 9 as a whole. I mentioned in the first episode on Book 9 that the offer from Agamemnon is framed as being virtually irrefusable. That much wealth would send the honor and status of a warrior into the stratosphere. At the end of the book, during the funeral games for Patroclus, the warriors are shown competing fiercely for much lesser prizes than this. And this is why the embassy is so baffled at his refusal. Each one of them would have readily accepted it. In Book 1, Agamemnon mentions he could take a prize from Ajax or Odysseus as well. What then would the Iliad have looked like? Well, we can actually piece together that situation, sort of. In Book 4, during the inspection of the troops, Agamemnon accosts Diomedes for hanging back and being apparently unwilling to fight. Instead of shooting straight back at Agamemnon, Diomedes instead, quote, did not answer him at all, respecting the rebuke of the honored king, end quote. Diomedes, the model warrior, would not have flared his anger at Agamemnon in Book 1 if his prize was taken. But Achilles did. It is this pride, this fiery passion within Achilles that prevents him from listening to the advice of old Phoenix and being persuaded to release his anger and accept the gifts. If we take this further, we see that if Achilles were able to be persuaded here, well, there would be no Iliad. He would accept the gifts, Patroclus wouldn't die, Hector certainly wouldn't die as quickly, and the Iliad would not be the Iliad. For the Iliad to exist, it needs Achilles as he is, passionate, fiery, proud, and capable of a rage beyond human limits. The second thing I'd like to touch on is Achilles' change in attitude that comes about during this book. I mentioned before that Book 9 can be considered the first book of Act 2. This 3-act division of the Iliad is a helpful framework for thinking about Achilles' motivations in the poem, and each act is characterized by Achilles imitating a specific character. In the first act, in response to losing his prize, Achilles imitates the priest Chryses, the one who tried to retrieve his daughter Chryseis from Agamemnon. Remember that when Agamemnon refused to return Chryseis, Chryses, who was a priest of Apollo, prayed to the god for help, and then waited for things to run their course. Now this is very close to Achilles in books 1 to 8. In book 1, he prays to his mother Thetis for help, and she calls in a favor from Zeus, who more or less guarantees the outcome that Achilles wants. He then withdraws from the fighting and lets the divine machinery run its course. The first act has Achilles imitating Chryses to receive his reward, but during book 9, he is provided with a new model for his behavior. The story of Meleager gives Achilles this model, but not in the way that Phoenix intended. The story was meant to show how Meleager did not receive any gifts because he returned to the fighting too late, and how that's a bad thing to do if you want to get gifts. But what Achilles heard from this is, oh, I can make everyone suffer even more if I wait until the very last moment to save them, then they'll really miss me. I've already mentioned how Achilles has no use for gifts, so the story that Phoenix tells could not have had the intended result, and instead it backfires. Thus, Achilles employs the Meleager model for the next act, stating he will only rejoin if Hector begins burning the ships close to his own. This is until Book 16, where again he adopts a new hero to emulate. I won't talk about that here, and instead save it for the end of the second act, but also because I need to get the book that discusses this in detail from the library again. This brings the long-winded and verbose 9th book of the Iliad to a close. We heard a lot of speaking, but not a lot has really changed, has it? Perhaps not a lot in terms of plot, but something has changed in Achilles, which will have ramifications later on. Next episode, we'll be covering Book 10, which is a bit of an oddity within the Iliad, and serves as a break in the flow of the story. For a long time, it was considered a separate story that was woven into the Iliad due to its strangeness. But the truth, of course, is a little more complicated than that. As always, if you've enjoyed this episode and want to hear more, please subscribe wherever you listen to your podcasts, or follow me on Substack to get all the episodes and anything else I find interesting on the Homeric epics, all for free. Until then, erostai akustoi philoi.